Hi, everybody who's watching. My name is Emily Shire. I'm the politics editor at Bustle, and I am so honored that I'm getting to moderate and that you're all joining a really fantastic panel called A View from the Balcony, Bridging the Gap Between Faith and Feminism. We have such incredible women who are going to be speaking to you about this really complex, rich topic, and it's all pegged to the absolutely wonderful movie, The Women's Balcony. If you haven't seen it yet, you really need to, and we're lucky here in the States that it's actually fairly accessible as far as foreign films go. I'm only going to say a little bit about the movie right now because we're lucky enough to have the screenwriter Shlomit Nahama with us, calling in from Israel, I believe. Yes, Shlomit?
Oh,
she's here.
Hi, yeah.
So I'm going to be asking her a lot of questions about the film as we get this underway. But just as a little bit of background, The Women's Balcony is the story of a small, tight-knit religious community in Israel. And when the shul's women's balcony collapses in the opening, it actually foretells the tensions and rifts over the role of women in the community, which will be exploited by a charismatic, holier-than-thou rabbi. The movie is wonderful for so many reasons, but I think the tone is especially great. It manages to be both genuinely touching, but also very funny. And it offers some really subtle but significant arguments that will make both religious and secular people of all faiths question their conceptions of the other group. So I think I've done enough talking. I want to get underway and introduce our fantastic panelists. Like I said, we have Shlomit Nahama. Shlomit grew up in Jerusalem in a religious family. She worked for many years on Israeli TV, mainly in children's programs and animation series. And The Women's Balcony is her first feature film. It was inspired by the story of her family and their neighborhood. And that's all I'm going to say for now because I have a few questions about that coming up in a little bit. We also have Phyllis Chesler. She is the Emerita Professor of Psychology and Women's Studies at City University of New York. She is a best-selling author, a legendary feminist leader, a retired psychotherapist, and an expert courtroom witness. She is the author of 16 books, including the landmark feminist classic, Women in Madness. We also have Judith Rosenbaum, who is the executive director of the Jewish Women's Archive. An educator, historian, and writer, Judith served for nearly a decade as the Jewish Women Archive's Director of Public History and Director of Education, developing its major programs and educational initiatives. She also won a Fulbright Fellowship to study women's collective communities in Israel. Also, if you guys haven't checked out the Jewish Women's Archives, they're awesome. I relied on their online services a lot in college. And speaking of college, we have Sharon Weiss Greenberg, who is awesome for so many reasons, and I was lucky to have her as my chaplain and a strong religious leader in college. She was the first Orthodox woman to be ordained a chaplain at Harvard University. She is now the executive director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. She was recently named by the Jewish Forward as a Forward 50 Jew of Influence and by the Jewish Week as a person to watch for the 36 under 36 list. Sharon is fantastic and has done so much interesting research and work on the Orthodox community. She is also the co-director and Orthodox advisor of the Orthodox Union Jewish Learning Initiative. Oh, that's what she did with me.
Yeah.
I was like, this sounds familiar. That's because that's how I met Sharon at college. But anyway, I think now we're ready to start a really fantastic panel, and I'm so glad you're all tuning in to watch. So, Shlomit, I wanted to start with you because I just wanted to get into what inspired you to write a film that would revisit your upbringing? And specifically, was there a personal event or a larger event in Israeli society that led you to write this movie?
When I started writing the script, it wasn't really clear to me where I'm going with it. I think I had like a terrible process with myself because, like you said, I grew up in a religious family, but at the age 18, I left the religion. It's when I can't leave, I left, and I didn't deal with it since then. It was a very my parents, like you can guess, didn't like it that I left, and we never really talk about it. I think myself, I just started a new life, a new non-religion life. Um, but when I started writing, it was like it's coming from missing this part of my life, from missing my childhood, missing the community, the warm community that I had in Jerusalem. And it developed to try to understand, if you so miss this, why did you left? And I think the reason are the drama of the movie. I think what happened to this community kind of happened to me. Um, I felt like the religion was very intimidated, and it was too much. And just when I finish to write the script, I understand that this is the reason, and I understand why I wrote it.
Wow. Were there, I was wondering, specific women in the community who inspired specific characters? Because one thing that's really great is how diverse the women are. Yes, they're all part of this tight community, and yes, they're all religious to different degrees, but each one is really strong in her own way.
Yeah. I took some women that I know, and I put them in a position. What I asked myself how they would react to some actions, like the actions that the movie show, and I believe that this is the way they will do the same. Sorry, it's my ear. It's okay. Um, because in my community, in my parents' community, there were just women and men were equal. It's never felt like women had their place, the men have their place, but they were different, but equal. And such as I think back then they didn't need to deal with the situation like they had in the movie, because they had a rabbi that he was one of the community. He wasn't from outside, and he knew the community. And the problem is the new rabbis that come in from the outside to communities and try to make them different. I think this is the problem, and this is why we see a lot of a situation like at the movie now in Israel.
You know, what I thought was interesting about the film is that it's actually a much younger rabbi who's forcing a lot of these tensions, who's really making the men and women, and he does it in an interesting way, but really downsizing the role of women in the community. So does that speak to something that you've noticed in religious communities in Israel, that it's often a younger force? Because we usually think of younger people being more progressive, wanting to shake things up, and this young rabbi really wants things to go extremely traditional and specifically restrictive towards women.
this is the young rabbis, or they're not young now, but they are the new rabbis, and it's connect. It started when religion and politics was connected in Israel. When they try to change community, to make them more the same. All the community need to be the same to have power. So it's belongs to the new generation. This is you're right. It's strange because you think that the new generation will be more open, but it's a reverse in the religion in Israel that I see. I don't know, but yes, this is very sad that this is the new religion now in Israel.
And now I would love to open things up a bit to our other panelists who have also seen this fantastic film. And one thing that really struck me, and I would love for everyone to weigh in on this, but maybe Sharon first. The Women's Balcony showcases women using their leverage, power, and strength to advocate for their desires, make them a reality. They're really empowered women. And at the same time, I think to a lot of, at least in the US and perhaps in Israel too, mainstream secular people, what they're advocating for doesn't fit a mainstream conception of feminism. And so Sharon, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about maybe stereotypes of Orthodox women that you've noticed some people have, and particularly, and I wouldn't be surprised if you got some of this, blowback from secular or detached from at least the Orthodox community, people who don't see room for feminism in the Orthodox world.
Excellent. Great. Small task there.
Sorry, I was like, that is a huge question.
I think it's important to define or better explain what empowerment is before moving forward. So I would define empowerment as having access to resources to accomplish said goals or tasks that you want to accomplish. And the reality is that you can't determine whether someone else is empowered. Only oneself can determine if he or she is empowered. So that's important. And I want to share a story actually. Soon after I was working at Harvard Hillel, and I was in touch with Dr. Beth Hyatt, who was this sort of mentor of mine when I was in college at Stern. And she said, what are some of the challenges? And I said, the number one challenge is being taken seriously as someone who's intelligent and identifying as an Orthodox woman. That's challenging in and of itself. And she said, go on. And as I was explaining some of the questions that were being posed to me, I said, I feel like I'm being looked at like a woman in a burqa. And she said, Sharon, how do you look at the woman in the burqa? And I thought, oh my God, you hit the nail on the head. That's a problem. So I think the same way I shouldn't be judging people who make choices that are different from me. I don't think it's wise to be judging people in our state. I think what Orthodox feminism in particular brings to the table is that we're constantly struggling with this because it's so obvious, and the more that I've been in this job and in the world, and the more cognizant you become, that sexism is everywhere. Sometimes it's just much easier to spot in certain communities, and I think it's actually a very positive thing that Orthodox feminists can say there's a ways to go in all of the movements and all religious affiliations that we can and should be doing better, whether it means women in leadership positions, in ritual, in rites of passage, we're not equal pay, things like that. They're just not happening in any community, religious or not.
That's really fascinating. And I also love that anecdote. Phyllis and Judith, I was wondering if because I know you both have specialties in looking at historic images, if you could give a little background and talk a bit about how we've come to develop, I guess, these stereotypes of religious women in Judaism, but perhaps religious women in general, because I think a lot of the stereotypes range, particularly from a secular group, are kind of negative. I think, Sharon, you hit the nail on the head with the burqa. kind of story, and how we think something either pitying or assume that there's a level of oppression. Where did this conception come from, and when do we really see it set in?
Who would you like first?
Well, you, Stokers, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, well, I want to make a general point that there seems to be among younger people in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, and in Judaism, in and outside of Israel, a search for tribal and radical roots. It's much bigger than the Jews. It's much bigger than religion in Israel. And I think also, just in response to what was just said, that a face mask is not the same as being a modern Orthodox feminist. Even though I know many women who wear hijab, just a head covering, who are fabulously feminist and are not wearing dark, forbidding, forbissina, like, you know, foreboding and scary looking coverings, so that there's a way to be religious, to signify that you are humble underneath the heavens, and that you have a place in a God-centered community without scaring off the children and without having to trip without visibility, because you can't really see in a burqa. I once lived in Kabul, and I can assure you, you can't, and you can't get sunlight. And it is very claustrophobic, and it lowers the self-esteem beyond belief. Now, the film is wonderful. I agree with you. It is incredibly an important themed film that is also tender and gentle and funny. And I think that it's not a war between the men and the women. I think that's a mistake. It's really a war between whether minhag, or custom, the custom of our mothers, is more or less important than a reading of halacha or religious law according to an outsider rabbi, young and soulful and cute as he may be. So the women are demanding not integration. They're very happy with separation, and that's another interesting subject, but they don't want to cover their hair. They want to be warm and tribal and connected and continue communal life that we've lost pretty much in the West, and that one of the reasons I suspect the film is so very popular and heartwarming is because we long for that and we don't have it. That's why we long for it, you know.
No, that's incredibly fascinating. And Judith, what are your thoughts, either on how we've come to think of religious women, and, you know, especially those of us who are not in tight-knit religious communities, or just to what Phyllis said about why there's something about this film that's so universal?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me what was really most powerful about this film was seeing the very positive depiction of female friendship and female networks. And I think, you know, that so often, as Phyllis was saying, there's kind of this depiction of feminism as being about only about, you know, anger or conflict between the sexes. And I think this film did a really great job of showing how much love there was among the women and what a strong community they had, and how they had their own ways of having power within their community. And also showing a lot of love between the women and the men, and really close relationships and partnerships, and a sense of respect and caring. You know, I think, you know, as a historian, I would say that this definitely really depicted a lot of the ways that women have had power and have found power even within disempowered or patriarchal kinds of situations in the past, found ways of working from behind the scenes, found ways of organizing themselves and finding kind of what we might call like domestic feminism in certain ways, or using female networks in different kinds of ways. You know, I think that for me, the one challenge is that there's a way in which depicting, there was a sort of caricature of the women as being so strong and smart and well organized, and the men sort of as being schlemiels a little bit. Like they couldn't quite figure, the women saw what was going on so much faster, and the men really took a long time to come around and figure out even how to deal with it. And I think there's a way in which that can sometimes be true, but I also think can mask some of the ways which there is a certain amount of authority or male privilege there. Like it kind of undermines an argument about the way patriarchy works by sort of saying, well, women are actually the ones who really have more power. And in some ways that reminded me of the kind of apologetic that the rabbi gives at the very beginning, where he says, actually women don't need to study Torah because they know more than men ever could possibly learn. And so women really have all the power and are much holier than we men are, and therefore they don't even have to learn. And so there's a way in which there's often this kind of apologetic built in to religious life that says, like, well, women can't have access because they don't actually need it because they're better than men. And if we say they're better than men, then we can take away certain kinds of access and power. So I kind of wondered how that dynamic, how that apologetic gets kind of played out in the movie. Like, it's very much called attention to. And then there's a way in which I feel like it's also a little bit repeated in the kind of caricature of how silly the men kind of are in some ways.
You actually anticipated a question I was going to ask, because I did find it very striking. I think I even wrote down the exact quote from the young rabbi who instructs the men. He says, "Do you realize how superior women are to us? Even if we study every day, maybe we'll reach the level of a woman who has never studied a day in her life. If a woman has such a great light, how should she protect it? Just as we cover, wrap, conceal the Bible scroll, so should a woman protect the holiness within her with modesty." And I'd like to ask, Shlomit, why did you decide to make that the rabbi's line of argument? Because it's apologetic is one way of putting it. I'd say both patronizing but a little friendly. It's like he's trying to make it a positive that women can't participate. And what factored in, I guess, to making his character like that? That he's sort of friendly with his sexism, to put it really bluntly and painted in broad brush strokes.
I just want to say that I'm listening to the ladies at the panel, and it's such a great honor for me that we are here talking about my movie. It's very exciting. About what you ask, you see, I sometimes one of the things that I don't like that it's when people taking the halakha, the Torah, and use it, like say something very high about women, about any other weak. So they took it and they said something very high, but they use it to make her small, like he did in the thing, in this speech that he said. And I saw it a lot. That you use, like you have some halakha that said that woman, you can't stand between two women, two pigs, and whatever. And I heard some rabbi that make from this, it's because the women are very in high level, or the fact that you say when you pray at the morning, you say, the men say, thank you for making me a man, and the woman say, thank you for doing my as you wish.
Of course, but let me make a point. I'm sorry, Shlomit. Shlomit, this is the point. Just because women are not obligated to pray or to study Torah doesn't mean we're forbidden. It's a very, very crucial distinction, which my chevruta, the late Rivka Hout, who was very involved with Jofa and an Agunah activist, kept stressing beginning in the 70s. So it's so that there's now such knowledge among Jewish women, learned, religious, or not religious and learned, so that this soulful, pretty boy, young rabbi character, what a wonderful, pretty face this actor has, you know, you could defeat him by knowledge. Now, this may not change his ways, but now more and more women are empowered by that knowledge, whether they pray only with women only, or in egalitarian quorums or minyanim. There are now choices opened, actually, to religion, to women in all religions. And your wonderful film, I can't stress enough how the past, the lost past, that we are sentimentally tied to, home-cooked food for bar mitzvah, it's unheard of, right? And yet, how perfect, how wonderful, and how we would love it in our lives. But the price that women pay to do that is very high. And the price women are forced to pay to be part of a close-knit, God-centered community like the film portrays is very much in conflict with independence and freedom and other pursuits and obligations that women have. Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that it was relatable. It resonated, those comments, that I've heard those things said by rabbis and women teachers. And I think I was 4 or 5 years old. I was in shul in the Beit Knesset in the hallway playing with friends, and there was a man who said, "You need to move because I can't walk in between women." And I was a little kid, and the objectification of a woman, you know, all the more so of a child, is certainly off base. And then it's also hilarious because you chose that anecdote, and then in the end the Torah gets put way above the rights of the woman there. So I'd imagine that was intentional, and I appreciated that.
It's very funny though, and what struck me though about that dynamic that the rabbi preaches, and maybe also Judith, to what you mentioned about how the women seem more in power and the men seem like these schlemiels, and how that's really good, but also kind of reinforced.
Can I have a small comment about it?
Please.
You must remember that from Jerusalem, and men from Jerusalem are a little bit schlemielic. This is the reason why they are like this, but I believe that the women are more empowered than men. Yes, sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say, has everyone on this panel seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yes, yes.
This completely reminded me, it's so not a Jewish culture thing. The line that's repeated a lot that the mother says, the man is the head, but the woman is the neck, and she'll turn the head whichever way he wants. I think that captures it completely.
Yeah, but I would be careful, because as feminists have documented, we're seeing home situations, and in the home where women are obliged to do everything and the men are not obliged to do anything, right? We're not seeing this in boardrooms. We're not seeing this in the Oval Office in America, in the White House. We're not seeing this in the Knesset. So we're seeing this in the one area where women reign, because women are obligated to do everything. And some do it with great love and sense of purpose and dignity, and they feel sanctified by it. And others feel utterly trapped and must flee for the sake of their very souls. So we're seeing it at home.
I think that's really important. And I think, I think we can see this historically, that women have, not just women, any group that has not had access to public authority has developed all kinds of back channels for how to get things done. That there is a certain creativity that comes out of being marginalized in some way. I think Judaism shows that very greatly. I mean, Judaism itself has developed all kinds of creativity out of being marginalized people. So I think that we see that in women's communities, and we see that in a lot of other kinds of communities of marginalized people who haven't had access to the kind of public authority of other people, that you learn how to compensate, and you learn how to be this is also where a lot of the negative stereotypes about people like Jews and other marginalized people come from. This idea that they're sneaky and that they're kind of manipulative, right? Like that comes out of a sense of how do you work the system when you don't have access really to the system. And so, you know, I think that there is something that is important to acknowledge about that kind of creativity, and acknowledge it as a way of power and a you know, give women credit for the ways that they have managed to shape communities and culture. And that's a lot of what we do at JWA, is try to tell those kinds of stories, not just the stories of the power on the front end. But I think at the same time, it's really important to acknowledge that does not make up for the other ways in which people can have power, right? That it doesn't, that it's a way that people develop to compensate, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't necessarily be given other ways of access to making, you know, to authority within a system.
Absolutely. It kind of raised me another issue that came to mind during the movie, is that we all have, I'd say, different conceptions of what would be, you know, kind of feminism in action. And one of the things I could anticipate someone saying is that, yes, even though the women are really strong in this movie and they clearly exert a lot of power, they're clearly so smart and creative, I could certainly also see someone, and I saw some reviewers note this, what they're pushing for, you know, they're not pushing to be on the bema, they're not pushing to be rabbis. They want, you know, their share of the space, but many people would say that's not an equitable part of the space. And first, I'd love to hear Shlomit weigh in, and kind of people who would say this, maybe it doesn't matter whether this is a feminist film or not, but what the women are pushing for won't leave maybe every viewer feeling great, because they want to see the women go even further. I think we could also say it's not their place to say whether the women should be going further, but just anticipating that, because I saw it did come up in some of the reviews, even the favorable reviews, just that it doesn't jive with our conception about what we expect women to want. A lot of people come to this with their own expectations of what feminism, what women in religion should be pushing for.
Is someone going to take that?
I
Close to Shlomi, I think.
Shlomi, and I could also rephrase that a bit better, which is, what would you say to people who don't think a women's balcony is enough? Like, they would have wanted to see Eddie push to be on the bema, or Eddie to be a rabbi, to push even further and further and further outside of what they show that they want in the film.
Well, I didn't hear all the question. I hope I get it, because sorry. But you see, one of the reasons that the movie is a feel-good movie or funny movie, it's because I wrote the movie for people. In Israel, the situation is that we are all Orthodox. All the religion, most of the religion are Orthodox, and this is the situation. I want to talk in the film about the basic equality between men and women, between every human being, or the kind of human being. And I want to say it to every woman that go to synagogue, or every woman that I didn't want to. I think we have to start with basic. I think we have problem with the basic. A woman doesn't feel like it's especially in the Orthodox really part of Israel, but it's right for all women. We don't believe that we are equal yet, so I want to start it with this. After we will be all feel equal, we can move on to other things, but I think the basic need to take care of first. And this is why the movie was, I will try to get to everyone with it, not some just for some. So
No.
I thought that was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, I think that's important to realize. So one comment that was made, the rabbi here is not necessarily enemy, right? He speaks to a lot of the men, he speaks to a lot of the women in the film, and not just because of his charisma. Some of the ideas that he's sharing are compelling to them, such that you see the women experimenting with the hair covering. Some are so turned off, and I loved that scene where the husbands come home with a big pachat and tell them to try it on, and their reactions to it. But then you do see, like, I think it's Tikva ends up taking on. She wants to cover her hair, and that helps sort of connect her with Judaism or spirituality or whatever it is. And I think it's important to note that that's part of the game. That's part of, if we want to empower people, to allow people to make those choices. And when it comes to Orthodox Judaism, one of the things that Jofa does, a lot of times people who are to the left of Jofa, we get criticized because many people walk into an Orthodox synagogue and say, tear that wall down, right? When they see a mechitza. And we actually are building a database to let people know where a mechitza is always available, because if there's no mechitza, it means that you're not welcome, that you're not expected to show up, and that's often the scenario. So we have one for when women want to say Kaddish for a loved one, where they can go, and the number one, there are two contingencies in order to make that list. One is that it's allowed, and that in the policy that they won't get kicked out, and we don't want someone to have to go through that scenario. And the other is that there's a mechitza, and there has to be a literal space for women. If there's not a literal space, then you're nowhere.
And I actually found one of the really powerful things about the film, that it wasn't placing this kind of conversation about feminism in the liberal community, right? It wasn't, I think often we think like, well, if you're going to be talking about feminism, you must be talking about a kind of liberal form of Judaism. And I think it was a really compelling argument for the way that feminism plays out in every single community, and that it's not just a, liberal versus conservative or liberal versus orthodox kind of position, that it's much more complex than that it affects every relationship, and that there are so many different ways that it can play out beyond the ones that we hear about all the time in public media. So I think this really challenged people to think about it differently, and to think about how do these relationships of power and dynamics play out in every kind of relationship. And it's not just a particular model that might be the easiest one for us to relate to, or that we're most familiar with.
No, I agree with you so much, because in the 1970s, when Rivka began the women-only davening groups, the right-wing Orthodox rabbis railed against it and gave her great grief, and that was seen as too radical and too feminist, that women would do a whole prayer service and learn from the Torah without men, with no rabbinic authority. But then, turn of the 21st century, you have that being looked down on as reactionary and not feminist, and egalitarian minyanim, Orthodox style, being viewed as more important, as really feminist. And it's interesting because some Orthodox feminist women feel, what do you need men for to feel that you're important? Does it make your relationship to God a greater light, so to speak, because you're joined with men? I mean, and so that there are very real feminist questions within each kind of community. And if you tear the fabric that the film is showing us, is very connected. We like all that warmth and the cooking and the sisterhood and the closeness. If we turn that into a secular style form of liberal reform Judaism, then we've lost the thread of the traditions. How do we do it? How do we move into the future without ripping apart the past, right?
I think that's a really tough question. And also, I think a really beautiful thing about the film is that it does show kind of unconventional, or again, I say unconventional coming from, non-Orthodox New York City circle. I think it forces you to think about the roles of women in a way that pushes against, it makes you be aware as an outsider of how you think the role of women should be. What I kept thinking back to, and it didn't become an issue until I went to college and was really exposed to a diversity of Jewish people of all religious backgrounds. I was personally raised conservative in a town that was mostly Reform, and suddenly I had a lot of friends who chose to, daven with a mechitza, which I just hadn't had thoughts of one way or the other. But I remember there was a discussion about Orthodox Judaism with some family friends who are Reform, but familiar with Judaism, but very distant from more traditional religious communities. And they were shocked that I had friends in college, female friends, who actively chose to participate in Orthodox minyans, and even said something, I think one of them even said, well, they must be brainwashed. And I was livid, because there's this patronizing aspect that a lot of people who are detached from the Orthodox community can have. And I think this movie really shows a lot of the nuance that will force people who are not as connected to this world, who aren't as familiar with it, to change what they think it means for a woman to be liberated in religion, or a woman to feel empowered in religion, and at least acknowledge that it's different for every woman. But there are a lot of different conceptions and ways of going about it. And I just love that about the film.
Yeah. Well, these women in the film, they adopt not only Alyssa Strata's strategy, which never works, but they did overt protesting. They did something that we could nobly and honorably claim as part of a secular feminist acting up. And they went public, and they had signs and placards, and they were very frontal in the confrontation. Very, you would think, out of character to sort of a religious Sephardic community, but they did it. And for them, it worked. And they got their balcony, their separate space.
I think part of what is interesting about this is that when you're advocating for change in a small community, it's not that easy. Like, there are relationships, and there are feelings, and there are people, and there's a rabbi who you've known for decades who's taught you Torah and who you respect a lot of what he may have to say, but there are areas of disagreement, and it's challenging. There are family members who feel differently about different sorts of Jewish politics, and I think that this hits on that in a humorous but real way. I also think before we had said how there's a few points where we said that the rabbi sort of manipulates halacha to satisfy what he wants, and I think an example would be like prioritizing the Sefer Torah over the space for women. It's not a clear-cut halacha. He's forcing his idea on this rabbi who's still not of good mind just yet. And then ultimately, I think what's interesting, it's not that people are calling out his manipulation of sources in order to meet his needs, it's that he violates one of the 10 commandments, right? Lo tigno, don't steal. It wasn't until he went that far that he stopped. And I think I think that's worth talking about and noticing.
That is a really interesting point. Does anyone want to weigh in, maybe Shlomit, on how the rabbi didn't have to
protect my rabbi? I want to protect him. One of the things that was very important to me, that who is saving the day it was Naftali, his lost son, or he learned everything from him. Just that we can see that the rabbi was made a mistake, a big one, but I think he really believes in what he's doing. This is, I think, just young. This is his problem. I think in a few years, he will understand it. I think just want to say he's not a bad person. He just made a big mistake. That's it.
I am going to shift you. Oh, did someone want to weigh in there?
I just said, as she was speaking, I said, Davash, kamo Davash, like honey. The feelings from the film, and at that moment when Shlomit was speaking. He's not a bad person. See, he made a big mistake, but he's not a bad person. How tolerant, how flexible is that sort of virtue? If only we could all aspire to that.
That is a weighty question, and I think a lot of the characters I'm seeing in some of the questions that we've gotten from people online, the rabbi has certainly sparked interest, but also we got a really interesting one about Yafa, Eddie's niece. And Shlomi, maybe you can speak a little bit about the importance of having someone represent a younger generation in the film, why you wanted kind of, and also a single person, someone who's a little bit of a different role than the other women.
Yafa is the only young generation in the film. That's I decided I want to symbolic the fact that it's no longer when these people would leave us, this community will be the end of this community. Yafa, it's like, you know, there's a little when you have lots of flowers and just one that coming up from Yafa is this little flower that coming out, it's an end of a period that we have. Yafa represents a small hope that we will keep living like this in such a lovely communities and such friendship and love between the people. This is what I like the most about the atmosphere. They feel like they love each other so much. This is Yafa, or Yafa, and she found a guy. This is the good news.
A good guy.
Yeah, the best.
I also,
the best. She
I
found
like
a good man in an awful place. She said, "Yeah, a song like this." She found love
you found
in
love
an
in a
awful place.
I love that we're working Rihanna in here. Yes, more of that, please. I don't know how purposeful it was, but I also like that she was always studying. So you got a sense that she had a very full professional, perhaps academic specifically, life. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this relates a lot to the women I met in college, where the way what they wanted for themselves religiously, they had different worlds and they had different desires, and they couldn't be boxed into one category in every community they operated in. And you know, that was really important to them. And I think we saw a little bit of that with Yafa as well. We also have another question, and this is more general, and whoever wants to weigh in, maybe all of you want to weigh in. Thinking in general, someone wrote, I'd like to ask the panelists how they think media coverage today is shaping the role of the image of a feminist. There's positive and negative press out there. How can we work this to the advantage of the feminist movement and to further shape the role of women in religious communities?
Well, there's such a rise today in fundamentalism within religion that it's a little bit difficult to say, oh, that's good, that's legitimate, we want that. On the other hand, precisely because of this misogynist barbarism that's rising, we want the comfort of a community. We want then to have a version of a tribe that doesn't exact ferocious prices from its members, beginning with its female members. So we want all the best of the Western civilizational values, which are based on Judeo-Christian tradition. We want free speech and intellectual diversity, and alas, separation of religion and state, which Israel has yet to achieve, and many other countries in the region will have never achieved or tried to. So we want both things, and the film is so fetching because it shows us a little bit of the protest, the activism, the Lysistrata, the strength of the women, and yet in the context of keeping part of what was a a fundamentalist moment in our tradition, or not fundamentalist, but a very traditional kind of Judaism, where indeed the women are happy without studying Torah, although they can, where they're happy keeping a home, loving families, loving community, and in a balcony where they have no ritual role. So the film gives us a little of both. It doesn't have yours.
I think that may be a little bit too black and white. There are Haredi feminists today. There's a Haredi feminist party, Vizchutan. You have Haredi feminist journalists who finally came out and said, by the way, those pseudonyms were male pseudonyms, and now we want seats on Haredi parties. So I do think that times are changing. I think all women want to get paid the same amount as men. I think that all women want access to an education. We see that with Adina Bar Shalom and her fight for women to have access to a college, university education. I think times are changing, and I think times changed we're on the 100th anniversary of the beginnings of the Beis Yaakov movement, where it's not just left-wing people who want to learn Torah. All women and all men think that all women should have access to learning Torah. Now, it may be different parts of the Torah, oral versus the written Torah, but I think I want to protect the fact that feminism and its ideals look differently in all communities, and within the spectrum there's a spectrum within modern Orthodoxy, there's a spectrum within ultra-Orthodoxy as well. I just want to be careful to protect that.
We're actually, it feels weird to say on that really important and nuanced note, but we're heading near the end of our session, and so it has been suggested that everyone we bring it back to the film, and maybe we can choose scenes that speak to these really nuanced points that you just mentioned. What were the most poignant scenes to you? If you could pick one scene that really encompasses why this movie resonated very deeply to you, because I think it's clear we all really loved the movie and found something very relatable in it, regardless of our backgrounds. What to you was that special scene? And maybe we can think about it a bit. And maybe first, Shlomi, what was your favorite scene to write? That might be a good way to kick it off.
My favorite?
Yeah.
Well, my favorite scene is the scene that Etty came to Sion, to bring back to bring back the plane at the end. This is my favorite. You remember the scene? The romantic scene?
I like a good romantic scene. Though I think
this is my favorite. I really love to write the Rav David speeches. It was such a challenge for me.
Interesting.
Yeah, I find in each scene something that I love, and I put my heart in.
I think I really loved the scene, and I believe it was Ora and Tikva after they go to the mikveh. That scene really struck me because I liked that it was a serious debate about observance and how we judge each other, even within this tight-knit community, where from the outside you'd think it's pretty much the same and very homogenous. You saw so much nuance and complexity, and not just complexity in what we choose to observe, but how we choose to judge each other because of what we observe, in this kind of, at the same time, gentle back and forth. There's a core of love there, but you see what they notice about each other. You see that there's a diversity in what people not only choose to observe, but find fulfilling. We see that people change in what they find fulfilling and what they don't. And it was so tightly contained in a very normal post-mikveh scene. Like, it was really lovely. And I thought that was incredibly powerful to carry so much meaning, Shlomi, in something that could be so basic and could have just been a boring bridge scene of very basic dialogue.
I really loved a lot of the moments among the women. And I think in particular, when Etty and Tikva make up after their fight, I loved that they didn't just kind of like say, let's just forget about it and move on. They actually apologized and they grappled with it and they teased each other, and there was clearly a lot of love there. But to me, that really, and we were saying this a little bit in the chat box, it really went against this kind of stereotype often of women as being catty and not really valuing each other's relationships, only sort of throwing each other under the bus all the time. And it really showed that yes, women can have real fights, but that's not because they're catty. It's because they love each other and they're in deep relationship, and then they work it out and they return to being strong supports for each other, and also they continue to challenge each other, and that's part of what friendship is about. It isn't just saying okay to whatever people do, or or kind of brushing it under the rug. It's really about being honest and challenging and also loving.
I loved Sion's relationship to the little boy who came to the shop, and I loved all the foods. I could almost taste them and smell them. I wanted to be there. And that was throughout the film, which fed me. It fed me.
I'm going to cheat and say my least favorite and most favorite. My least favorite was the moment where you think there should be like the oppressor has been defeated, and when the rabbi walks in and sees that they're building a women's balcony. But it's still sad. And I think that's good, to realize that it's not just like, yay, we won, the oppressor. I mean, I think there's that sadness that's that resonated. I loved the mipachat scene. I love it when the husbands come home and like, I got you a gift, and like, we don't get gifts. And then the responses are hilarious. And I love like at the end, you think I think it's Etty, where you think she's actually going to do it. And then she's like, for Purim, it will be perfect. And it's amazing. And I love that, because feminism, a lot of times I feel like I've been told that I can't be funny, and we're just so funny. It's really hard to hold that back. And I think we should be allowed to use humor to call things out. And, I think it's a great tool and value in terms of ourselves for coping or sort of dealing with the status quo, but it speaks to people. And it felt like a breath of fresh air to just be able to laugh at some of the challenges that we face.
We are sadly now at the end of our time, and I do mean sadly, because this has been such a privilege for me to, first of all, Shlomi, to have you and get to pick the brain of the writer of this wonderful, wonderful film is such a treat. I think I speak for all the other panelists to say that this is a real gift for us. And to everyone on the panel, Judith, Sharon, Phyllis, thank you so much, because you're all brilliant and you all offer these really complex, fascinating, insightful perspectives on the film. Thank you to all of you who've weighed in with questions. It's been great seeing the dialogue on the side. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, you really need to go see it. If you want to find out where you can see it, and by the way, it's in cities playing across the US right now, you can look up the film schedule at menemshafilms.com. That's MENEMSHA films.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.